This is Professor Lynn Porter from Fairfield University, and this is the introductory lecture to my class on architecture history called What We Leave Behind. I'm going to center this conversation around the idea of built spaces, and then I'm going to unpack some basic building materials that we need to understand this semester. So starting with built spaces, I want to start with a basic question. Why do humans make buildings? Sounds like an easy question, doesn't it? Think about it. Why do we make buildings? Why do we need buildings? Well, pretty obviously, we're aware that humans need protection from the elements. We need to come in from the rain. We need to have a place where we can not be in the cold or not be in the snow. So we need some kind of protection from the weather that Mother Nature throws at us. That's a really big function of buildings for us, isn't it? And in the process of making those buildings, we've started to specialize the buildings and even the spaces within the buildings for all of the human activities that we have. We have a kitchen space that's designed to deal with our food preparation and food storage problems. We have bedrooms that are specialized for sleeping. We have churches and synagogues and mosques for celebrating religious ritual. We have buildings where we work. We have buildings where we play. We have buildings where we govern and make laws for how humans should act toward one another. So there's various spaces for our very human activities. And sometimes we make buildings or built structures that are designed to memorialize a person who's been important to an individual or maybe to a particular country or culture. So sometimes built things have to do with memory. And how we choose to design and build these structures absolutely expresses certain ideas and values of the people who are building them. So as we look at various built structures over the course of the semester, we're going to regularly ask you what ideas are being expressed here. What did the people who built this value in their society? And as I just said, we have a variety of needs. So our structures are designated for those activities. And I like to break this down into two very distinct categories: public spaces and private spaces. When I say public spaces, I mean churches and government buildings and offices and museums and parks and schools. All of those tend to be spaces that we think of as public. Here's a great example of a public space: Exeter Cathedral in England. Lovely Gothic cathedral for celebrating religious services. And here's a government space, also public, our town hall in Woodstock, Vermont. What a lovely little building. Here's a very high-tech building, Amazon's Urban Tree House, being built in Seattle, designed to both be a high-end office building in the middle of a major city, but also trying to say something energetic and exciting about how this company views its place in the world. And when we look at private spaces, really what we're doing is looking at domestic spaces or residences. Here's a beautiful photograph of some very famous buildings in San Francisco, Victorian painted ladies. They were built in the late 1800s, and all of them are painted in their own beautiful way. So yes, painted ladies are a wonderful example of some private spaces. Here's another private space, another domestic space, a craftsman style house in Canton, Ohio. And here's a more recent space. This is what we would call a McMansion, a very contemporary thing that has happened in the United States in particular, ever since the late 1980s. McMansions tend to be large, which is where the mansion word comes from, and the Mick part of it tends to be how they're assembled in ways that frankly don't make sense in terms of the architectural rules that came before them, but they tend to be very large and ostentatious. If you're ever looking for a good chuckle, I do recommend the website blog called McMansion Hell, where the proprietor of that site regularly roasts really, really ugly buildings. It's very funny and very snarky. But getting back to things, because we have buildings that are broken up into various spaces inside, we can have various levels of public and private depending on where you are in the building. So, for example, in a domestic house, in a residence, obviously bedrooms and bathrooms are more private than the living room and the kitchen area. Uh, for another example, in a store, you have the merchandise area, the place that we go to shop for things, and then the storeroom or the offices that are much more private, and we as customers are not even expected to go into those spaces. So there's varying levels of public and private in every built space, depending on how it's being used. And this is something I want you to really think about. When we build something, we build a physical thing. It's got floors and walls and roofs and doors and windows. So we build physical things, but we experience it as humans through its voids. It's through the enclosed spaces. The space between the walls is the space we inhabit, which is obviously why we call it space. It's open. So how we experience a building has to do with the shape of the voids within the building. Real estate people talk about flow of a building where there's a flow of how people can move through a house or move through an office space. And that is something that is absolutely controlled by where we put the physical obstructions to contain the space. So when we think about building structures, not only are we thinking about what kind of walls and roofs and doors am I going to put in, but we think about the shape and the nature of the enclosed space because that will affect our experience of it as humans. So those voids affect how we move through the space and also how we experience interactions with other people. It's rather fascinating how buildings can affect how we think and feel. Look at this space, the lovely Chartres Cathedral in France. In this space, imagine you were standing exactly where this camera is placed. How would you move in this space? How would you feel in this space? Where would you look? It seems to draw us forward, doesn't it? Yeah, it has this real strong longitudinal line, but it's also an upward line. It tends to move us up too, doesn't it? How would you feel? Would you feel depressed and lonely in this space? Would you feel maybe a little bit of awe in this space? I don't know. What do you think? For a contrast, let's look at one of the interiors of those beautiful Victorian painted ladies. This is the front sitting room. The space affects us very differently than that cathedral I just showed you. How would you be able to move in this space? See, the walls and the decor, the furniture and the stuff, even the stuff hung on the wall, affects how we're going to move throughout the space. If we were standing in this room right now, do you think you would feel exactly the way you felt if you were standing in that cathedral? So the space affects our experience. I do want to point out that we also have monumental structures, not necessarily buildings, but the monumental structures that commemorate a person, an event, a culture. So there's many forms that our monumental structures take, not necessarily buildings. Let me show you some examples. Here we have the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., commemorating Washington's contribution to the founding of the entire country. It's one of the major monuments in that city full of monuments. I don't think it's even technically a building, though you can get up inside it. But it's built to talk about the majesty of this new country that Mr. Washington helped make. But of course, I find it fascinating that in the founding of this new country, we used an ancient Egyptian obelisk to commemorate the contributions of one of the founding fathers. I'm going to ask you to keep your eyes open for this dynamic where we have a structure that is claimed by a particular culture, but then centuries later may be reclaimed or reformed slightly for a very different culture. We'll see this throughout the semester. But this obelisk is a great example of that dynamic. Here's another example of a monumental structure, the Taj Mahal. What a beautiful building to house a tomb, one tomb. What about this monumental structure, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris? That is not a building, it is simply a big arch in the middle of the city honoring the French who fought and died in both the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, right? So it is simply a big arch stuck in the middle of the city. Of course, it harkens back to ancient Rome, even though it was built in the middle of the 1800s. So again, we're going to start seeing how things that are built recently are really reflections of things that were ancient. We'll see this throughout the semester. Okay, let's move along to thinking about the materials we use to make these structures. What kind of building materials can we use? Actually, there's quite a lot. And the history of architecture has a lot to do with what kind of materials are available in that area. And so there's lots of different ways that people have found to alter their environment. And I like to break this down into two basic categories: natural materials that Mother Nature grows for us, and human-made materials that humans have figured out how to make over the centuries. In the northeastern United States, you had the Penobscot, and this is a great picture of a birch bark wigwam in an area that has a lot of trees, and birch trees in particular that you can peel the bark off of. It makes sense to use these materials to make a structure to protect you from the elements. But in the Great Plains of the Midwest, you don't have birch trees. You don't have many trees at all. So that doesn't exist. And here's a great example of an animal hide teepee that was built by the Oglala tribe, solving the same problem. How can we protect ourselves from the elements? In other parts of the country, you have lots of brush or reeds that can be tied together into bundles, and then the bundles of reeds themselves can become a structure. And here we see an Ojibwe combination of bark and logs and reeds, all of them pulled together to make a structure. So it all depends on what Mother Nature gives you in terms of what kind of natural materials you can use. And this is true not just for indigenous peoples, but for people today. In Ireland today, people use reeds and grasses for thatched roofs. In fact, I've seen thatched roofs in Connecticut. So this is still a building material that's used throughout the world today. In the Great Southwest, stucco is a major building material. It's literally made from mud that is used as this wall surface to cover over this looks like a stone wall. You see a lot of stucco in the Great Southwest. And of course, wood can be cut and planed and shaped into a variety of different shapes and forms. So it doesn't just have to be a branch. Now we can have a wood floor, or this is actually a reclaimed wood floor where the wood planks have been taken out of a building and cleaned up and put together again into a new, different surface. Here's a parquet floor in France that's centuries old. Different types of wood are different colors and have different characteristics. So in this parquet floor, you can see how different colors have been arranged to help create the pattern. And it always amazes me how innovative humans can be. This is a house made of sod in Nebraska. When pioneers moved to Nebraska, they realized there were no trees that they could use to build buildings. So they literally cut sod out of the earth and made these large blocks of it, and then made houses out of sod. Amazing materials, amazing ingenuity. Of course, this is the same area in the world where we saw that Ogallala hide teepee. So, two different cultures solving the problem in two very different ways. A sod house tends to be a structure that is permanent, that it's stuck there in place, whereas that hide teepee is something that could be broken down and could travel with the nomadic peoples so that they could move it to another place. Two different points of view on how to solve the same problem. When we're talking about natural materials, we also have to talk about stone. And stone can also take a variety of different forms. Here you see a very old stone wall that was built out of stones that were simply piled together and then somehow attached together with some kind of cement or mud in between the different stones. But they haven't been shaped. They've simply been stacked up together with some mortar. In contrast, here we have the Palace of Versailles. Most of what you're seeing in this image is stone. So different stones with different colors and qualities that have been cut and polished to a very high degree. So again, natural materials, stone can have a variety of different looks. And with the tip of the hat to a little bit more human ingenuity, I want to point out that the Inuit use ice and snow to build a structure. Again, you use what you got. And obviously, where you are, what your region is, will affect the availability of these various building items. And of course, they demand different tools. A knife that you might use to cut a bundle of reeds will not be helpful when cutting the stone. So the tools and the materials tend to be regionalized. Of course, with communication between different cultures and humans finding ways to move across larger areas of the planet, you start to see a really beautiful mix of materials and methods as we look at the history of humanity. In terms of the human-made materials that we use to build, I do want to talk about cement, which naturally grows. So Mother Nature grows the limestone or the chalk that can then be refined into lime. And then when you mix it with water, it dries very, very hard. Rarely do we use cement on its own, but it's an essential piece of concrete. Which brings me to concrete. Concrete has three components. It's got water, it has the cement that I just talked about, and it also has an aggregate. Right here, I've shown you a pile of gravel, or it could be something as fine as sand, or it could be chunks of stone the size of your fist. So the size of the aggregate will affect the nature of the concrete. When you mix the water with the cement and the aggregate, it becomes what they call a slurry, which is rather fluid. It can be poured and molded. And then once it all chemically binds together, the cement binds with the aggregate and forms that solid piece of concrete. In terms of the history of architecture, the invention of concrete is one of the landmarks that affected how buildings could be built. You're probably used to seeing concrete being molded into specific blocks, or cinder blocks, we usually call them. So there are many ways and many structures we can make using concrete as a material. Another human-made material is a brick. Bricks are made from clay, which is natural. Mother Nature grows the clay, but then it's mixed with other binding materials and put into molds and then baked. And once the water is baked out of them, they become the hard brick that we all know and love. And once you have a pile of bricks made, then you can lay them in courses or rows and then bind them together with mortar, which is a form of concrete. So just like the Legos we played with when we were children, you can have a number of small pieces and then you can arrange them together into large structures. And just in case you thought brick buildings were boring, I give you this. This is a flamboyant Gothic style church in Lithuania, made centuries ago. You were using 33 different shapes of bricks. 33 different shapes. Amazing. Another human-made material we have to talk about is glass. Glass is made from a mixture of sand and silicates, both of which are natural, but then it's bonded together by firing it. And of course, we know that glass is very hard and very brittle, but it leaves this beautiful, smooth surface. Glass is a major building material once we get into the 20th century. Other human-made materials are the metals. One of the main metals, especially of the Victorian age, was steel, mostly made of iron and carbon. It's very, very strong. Of course, one of the problems with steel is it rusts easily, as you see here with this wonderful picture of this railroad bridge in Pennsylvania. Another metal that's used quite a lot in building structures is aluminum, one of the great developments of the 20th century. Aluminum is lighter and more flexible than steel, and bonus, it doesn't corrode in water, it doesn't rust. And you can see with these pictures that the material is different from anything else we've looked at. And that also means that the shapes of the buildings and the structures can be different. You could not do that kind of a curved roof with steel or brick or concrete. Another building material that's in the metal category is copper. And copper is great because it tends to resist corrosion and looks gorgeous. It has a very particular look to it. And it's very, very soft. So it can be shaped into all kinds of really beautiful and interesting detail shapes. And usually when you see copper in a building, it's used as an accent. You see it just the shape of the gutter, the shape of the downspout. And it's all one of the reasons why it's also used as an accent is because it's very, very expensive. Copper is grown by Mother Nature, so it has to be mined and pulled out of the earth and then refined into the the shape that you see here. So it's a multi-step process. The more steps involved in it, the more complicated those steps, obviously the more expensive the building material is going to be. Another building material developed in the 20th century is plastic. These tend to be made from petrochemicals and can be made in a huge variety of shapes and forms. And because it's really a chemical process to make the plastic, um, the properties themselves are very, very malleable. You can have some plastics that are transparent, some that are translucent. Here you see the Vienna Technical Museum. These structures, they're actually benches in the lobby that are also lighting structures in the lobby. So it can be transparent, it can transmit light, it's sturdy enough to be sat upon or to be shaped into a particular shape. So, so a variety of things can be made of plastics, and it tends to be a very common building form of the latter half of the 20th century. Phew, that's a lot of materials you can use to make a building, isn't it? Wow. All right, I'm going to leave you with one last thought. The durability of your construction is absolutely dependent on the durability of your materials. Thank you for your time and attention.